holiday listeners, and welcome back to the Wool Shift Dust Winter Tales Lounge. Pull up a chair for a storytelling nightcap, a look at the life of the man who is said to have invented Christmas, plus the 2017 film, The Man Who Invented Christmas. This is the second public episode in our A Christmas Carol 2024 Winter Holiday Series, third if you want to count the intro app. So I recommend starting with that introductory app where we lay out everything we're covering this year. And there's also the classics episode in this feed where we talk about some of the most iconic, most faithful versions of A Christmas Carol. So I guess I didn't introduce myself. I'm Elysia, and I'm here as always with Luke. And Luke, are you a Dickens fan overall, aside from A Christmas Carol?
No, I would have to say I am a Christmas Carol fan before I am a Dickens fan. It was not weirdly, it was not something we did at school. We did a lot of Shakespeare. We did a lot of Shakespeare, but no Dickens.
Oh, we definitely, I mean, most of the Dickens I read, including this, was at school. And actually, my low-key favorite was Nicholas Nickleby, was his third novel, so written before this one.
Okay.
He kind of got depressing at the end.
Yeah. I got that impression doing the research. He kind of wanted to be considered an author, you know.
Yeah. Very serious. But that's when he wrote, like A Tale of Two Cities and Great Expectations,
Yeah.
Which are considered his seminal works. But I like Nicholas Nickleby, which is like a caper,
Okay.
But this episode, this is going to be a shorter one. It isn't meant to be an exhaustive look at Dickens. It's just the intermezzo of our little series this year. But we know a few things about his life that we think will give you a deeper appreciation of the story of A Christmas Carol. And we're going to use the 2017 film, The Man Who Invented Christmas, the one starring Dan Stevens, as a framework to open the conversation. So we'll get into what we thought about the film in a minute, but just to set it up, it was directed by Bharat Nalluri. And Nalluri previously got an Emmy nom for the HBO miniseries Tsunami: The Aftermath. And that's the one, like, when I see the cast was like Chiwetel Ejiofor, Sophie Okonedo, Tim Roth, Hugh Bonneville, Toni Collette, like crazy good cast. I remember seeing trailers for this one, but I never watched it.
No, I've got to say I never heard of it, so I need to dig that out.
I remember there were like two Tsunami movies that came out at the same time,
I remember the one with Ewan McGregor and Naomi Watts.
I didn't watch that one either, yeah. And this was the other one, I guess.
Okay.
But Nalluri also directed the pilot of The 100. And The 100 is an imperfect show, but the pilot is not the problem. The movie was written by Susan Coyne, who's apparently known for co-creating and starring in a show called Slings and Arrows, which was it is a TV series that ran in the early noughties about a Canadian Shakespearean theater company. I've never heard of it before. Sounds fun. And this is her only film writing credit. This is based on a book by Les Standiford, who has... Yeah, the book's called the same thing, The Man Who Invented Christmas. I haven't read it. I'm assuming you haven't either?
No.
So we can't really comment on it as an adaptation of that. I've seen reviews that basically said what you would expect. It really cuts things out and simplifies. And just based on what I know about Dickens' life, I'm like, yeah.
Yeah, it certainly does.
It's a Canadian-Irish co-production, and you can find it now on Disney Plus, or maybe Hulu in the US. I don't really know. Starring Dan Stevens and Morfydd Clark, and it's about Dickens writing the book A Christmas Carol, what his life was like at that moment, his childhood that led to that, basically the various influences that went into that happening and how it happened. So this was actually one of the first that you watched out of the whole bunch. Let's take a listen to what you thought then.
So I've just finished watching The Man Who Invented Christmas, a fictionalized version of the writing process for A Christmas Carol. I quite enjoyed the film. It's very much a pastiche of ye olde Victorian England, but nothing wrong with that. It is one of those films that has every British actor that can stand and deliver lines. So we have Jonathan Pryce, we have Christopher Plummer, we have Ian McNeice, We have several others who I don't know their names, but they crop up everywhere. It's really a story about Charles Dickens dealing with his own childhood trauma, because his father was bankrupt and sent to debtor's prison, and Charles Dickens had to work as a bootblack as a small child. I don't know how true to life. I know that Dickens' father was bankrupt, and I know that he did go to the poorhouse. I don't know how accurate the rest of it is. Nevertheless, it was funny. It was touching. It was darker than I expected for a Christmas movie. It was slightly hallmarky in its portrayal of Victorian England, but I can forgive it that. On the whole, I enjoyed it.
All right. Do you still feel the same way?
Yeah, I do. And having done a bit more research, there are obviously bits of it that aren't true to life, but there are bits of it that are fairly close to. There are bits that are fairly close to the history. I mentioned in the introduction that Dan Stevens would make a great Doctor Who,
Right.
And if ever he was cast as Doctor Who, I think this should be his show reel, particularly when he's talking to the imagined spirits.
Ghosts. Yeah.
Yeah, there's something about the way he delivers that performance that is very high energy. It's very
right.
It's very Doctor Who.
I mean, he could perform like some pharmaceutical terms and conditions, and I would sign up to watch. I love Dan Stevens. I also love Morpeth Clark. Others may know her best as Galadriel from Rings of Power, or she's also in some great horror films. But yeah, I would watch either of them just for themselves, so let alone together. I was really excited about this film. I ended up giving it 3 stars, which is okay. It's not bad. I said the concept and cast seemed ideal, and the actors really lived up to their roles, went beyond, really. The production design was incredible, and there were some really stunning lighting moments as well. It's just a shame that the story felt so stiltedly superficial and paint by numbers, given how much they had to work with. I found myself eager for it to be over despite starring actors I adore. Fantastic production design and some great, I already said the great lighting moments, but it bears repeating. I actually tried to look up who was in charge of the lighting, and that's apparently just not easy to find online. Lighting techs should get more credit.
Yes.
But yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm slightly less warm on it than you, but I'm glad I watched it.
So a friend of a friend actually works at, I don't know whether he still does, but he certainly worked for years at Dickens World, which is the theme park / museum to Dickens in Chatham in Kent.
I don't think I knew that existed, but now I really want to go to there.
Yeah, no, he was one of the it's like a little Victorian model village thing. He was one of the characters that was like one of the tour guides that took people around the model village in character. So I've seen him in the suit and the stovepipe hat and the fake beard and everything.
That sounds like a lot of fun. I actually really enjoy that sort of thing. But yeah, so from the historical perspective, the movie does a decent enough job checking off the important points from his biography. I do like how they pay attention to how he pissed off Americans for a while and then won them back with this book, basically. We see his previous success from Oliver Twist, and yes, and that's also true, and Pickwick Papers and Nicholas Nickleby, but he did have some books that weren't making as much in between. They talk about his tour of the US, which was like a big thing because also, well, this is why he wrote the mean things about Americans, because he walked away thinking that Americans were basically too into money and celebrity and a bit racist and uncaring. Which, okay. Yeah, I grew up in the US.
Speaking of being uncaring, the one thing it really does gloss over is Dickens' relationship with his wife, which was
right.
Yeah, which was not good, and the movie.
It sounds like it deteriorated over many years.
Yeah,
to the point he almost got her committed.
I think he got committed. Tried to
Well,
get a
he
committed
tried
on.
to, but it didn't pan out. But that was a very, like, Rembrandt, the
Yeah,
painter. He did that to his wife. It was a very Rembrandt move.
and
Rembrandt was a
also
known.
and
Yeah.
also like Dickens. I mean, Dickens had an odd relationship with women altogether because I don't know how true this is, but what I read was when his father was released from debtor's prison, his mother wasn't like as keen that he should come home from the bootblacking factory immediately, and like Dickens held that against her for the
Oh,
rest of his life.
okay. I know that he did continue to work there. I just assumed that, yeah, they because basically, so his father got arrested and put in debtor's prison for spending too much money, and his mother and their brothers and sisters. He was the second of 8 children, and 2 of them died young, but so 6 who survived into adulthood. And so everyone but him and his older sister Fanny, who does that sound familiar from the from the book? Um, the rest of them basically had to move into debtor's prison with their father because that's like they couldn't afford rent. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
and
that lasted about a year, and then afterwards, and then yeah, so the good fortune was that his father's mother died and they inherited some money.
and Marshalsea Prison, the debtor's prison his father and his family was in, is actually part of Dickens' world.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Um, so it's like a historic building, but I think part of it is the gift. Part of it is the gift shop, rather amazingly tackily.
Yeah. Well, mm, yeah, so much for not being commercial, but
Yeah.
yeah, I do just find it amusing that he went to the US, did some tours, wrote some books where he was perhaps a little too candid for our American cousins, as they put it in this film. And then he wrote this book, and then they're like, okay, we forgive you. And then he went back to America and did more tours.
I mean, there is even a slight dig at the United States in A Christmas Carol when the ghost of Christmas Past turns up, and Scrooge thinks he slept
Hmm.
all the way through to the next day when it's none of his loan agreements would be worth more than the United States Treasury bond.
Right.
And that was because actually in the 1840s, the US was considered a massive credit risk
Hmm.
because of fear of civil war over slavery, basically. So, like, the US government could only raise money but at like really exorbitant rates of interest.
Okay. Hmm. And they also brought up a copyright lawsuit. In this case, over someone doing an unauthorized version of his Oliver Twist called Oliver Twisted. But this was a this was a constant problem for him at this time, and it also became a problem. We'll talk about it a bit more with A Christmas Carol because they didn't really have the protections at the time that people could copy these or could make an unauthorized play and earn more money off this story than he did. What did you think of the characterization of Dan Stevens as Dickens in this
I mean,
movie?
he comes across both as incredibly likable, but also a bit of an ass,
Yeah.
depending on which part of the movie we're in and who he's talking to. He's clearly got a lot of like unresolved anger towards his dad, which is understandable.
Mhm.
But like he's very much portrayed as like the tortured artist,
Mhm.
which it's like no, you don't. You can be talented without being an ass.
Yeah.
Like,
Well, what I get from, here reading about what other people said about him, his contemporaries, is that it seems like he probably had ADHD and he was just really overbearing for his own family, but then really fun to be around for people who spent less time with him.
yeah, and it's really odd given the amount of affection that for children that is clearly in A Christmas Carol, and given his sort of general affection for or his general sympathy with the poor and particularly with children, that he doesn't seem to have liked his own children he doesn't seem to have got on with his own children very well.
Yeah, we see him in the film say, "Bye, little strangers," to them, and I do love that line because it just tells us very quickly what his relationship is with them, but also how he just like is making a joke out of everything.
Yeah.
It's also one thing I do like about the characterization in the film too is that we see that he wants the trappings of wealth to like probably to kind of prove something to himself, but at the same time he's looking at his father who is and was in real life going around town and using his son's name to borrow money and things like that. He doesn't want to become that. So there's this conflict between those two sides where he wants to be have made it and not be the have gotten away from the struggles of his youth, but also doesn't want to repeat the mistakes of the last generation.
Yeah. And I thought one of the most effective scenes in the movie is Dickens finds his father like rummaging through the garbage because he's selling like Dickens's letters and papers as like memorabilia, and that's the moment that like Charles Dickens, as played by Dan Stevens, kind of snaps with him completely.
Yeah.
And I thought Dan Stevens and Jonathan Pryce. I mean, Jonathan Pryce again, one of those actors you could listen to read the phone book. But the way they do that scene is really excellent. It kind of lifted the whole movie.
Yeah. Well, it is a movie where I got more appreciation of what they fit into it after, because I watched the movie first and then kind of did a little deeper research after. And so, for example, there's a throwaway line about, he's like, "But I bought you a house," and and his parents still just want to be in London. And then you find out, oh yeah, he bought his parents a house in Devon, which looks like a very pretty place. And he thought that if they were away from the city, they would stay out of trouble. But then they just kept coming back to the city.
Yeah, and like in the 1840s, Devon was a long way from London.
Right. Yeah, no, the way, you brought up his relationship with his wife, Catherine, but I thought they portrayed that well also, where he was just careless toward her, like he just was indifferent toward her.
Yeah.
And he was attaching to they made up the character of the Irish nanny maid, whatever her job was. But apparently there are stories of him basically behaving like that, like say he sees some pretty young thing who captivates his attention for a moment, and yeah, and
Yeah.
his wife's just like, okay.
I mean, I thought Monica Clark did a really good job with a part that didn't actually. She's not got that much to do,
Right,
in the movie, but she takes a relatively small part, and makes it bigger by her performance. I guess is what I'm trying to say.
yeah, yeah, yeah. One change from the movie made that I do take issue with is they showed the raven. So he did have a raven named Grip. He actually had a succession of 3 ravens named Grip and an eagle at one point. But they showed his father basically trading something for, and giving that to the kids, and the kids wanting to keep it and stuff. In real life, the kids were afraid of the raven because it would bite their ankles, and like um, but the first Grip was really smart and could, speak some words. But that Grip actually died in 1941, so 2 years before the events that are portrayed in this film. And Dickens thought that it died, that the raven died by drinking paint that had lead in it. And Dickens thought someone might have poisoned his raven. But he stuffed the bird and placed it on display, and actually he got a new raven, same name, but apparently he said this one was dumber, and eventually there was a third raven. But the first raven's remains passed from Dickens collector to Dickens collector and ended up with a Poe collector in Philadelphia. And it now is on display in the rare book department of the Parkway Central Library in Philadelphia. And it's believed that this raven is actually the inspiration for Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. Because Dickens and Poe met twice in Philadelphia while he was touring the US. And, he told him about his raven and showed him pictures or like showed him drawings or whatever. And and people point out that, Poe's raven says nevermore, and they say that sounds like Grip. The raven would speak and said, "Never say die," and nobody. And at the end of the Dickens book, Barnaby Rudge, Grip makes a noise, and someone asks, "What? What was that? Him tapping at the door?" And someone responds, "'Tis someone knocking softly at the shutter," which sounds very much like the poem. So, rap, rap,
Yeah.
rapping on my chamber door. Yeah.
Yeah. I also found out that while Dickens was working as a journalist, because before he became an author, he was a parliamentary sketch writer.
Mm-hmm.
He was living in Camden, which is the same part of London that Bob Cratchit lives in.
Okay.
In A Christmas Carol.
Yeah, yeah. So what did you think of the other characters other than what did you think of the households? We had Mrs. Fisk, we had Mr. Forster, who's based on a real person who was his friend, but then they added this whole romance plot where he wants to propose to Miss Wigmore, but then they break up because he's only the son of a butcher. And yeah, this is a whole added plot. I'm not sure what that added. But he was in real life a friend who supported him during this time and later wrote a biography about him.
And was kind of sort of, the film implies, sort of acting as a sort of literary agent.
Yeah.
Kind of.
I guess so.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there was also Thackeray, a rival who's rubs Dickens' face into middling reviews. I guess that's comedy relief.
I love Miles Jupp playing Thackeray. It's just brilliant. And also, like, as an academic, you either are a Thackeray or you know a Thackeray. Like, everybody knows that person whose project is just a bit more advanced than yours, whose reviews are just a bit better than yours, and won't mind letting you know about it. That was very relatable.
Well, I think it was his maybe jealousy of Dickens.
Miles Jupp is the guy that plays him, and he's a very funny stand-up comic, actually, but he does do a little bit of acting as a kind of side gig.
Okay. In the film, though, it gave us some Hollywood moments of inspiration. So apparently, Dickens was renowned for just kind of sitting and observing and writing things about people, but that's basically what all writers do. So we see him here. He meets a waiter named Marley, and like, oh, he collects names, which I guess is broadly true. But we talked about, I guess that was in our novella episode. We talked about how probably the name Scrooge and Marley were based off a sign that was near where he grew up. I liked the addition of the Irish maid Tara with her. Basically, I liked broadly the addition of her. With her saying like I don't know. Actually, you know what? I completely take that back. It still bothers me, even with the spooky stories, because so the movie implies that he doesn't know that spooky stories are popular at Christmas, that only the Irish lass will know that because it's because it's when the veil is thin and winter solstice. Like, well, he lived in Victorian England. He freaking knew that it was ghost story season.
Yeah. And I did wonder, looking at the end credits, it got funding from like the Irish government,
right,
Irish film board, whatever. So I wondered whether you kind of
have to have
an explicitly Irish character in there somewhere.
Which that's fine. I don't mind them adding an Irish character. Just like I'm not sure I like the way she was added. And then also at the end, she's like, "Don't let Tiny Tim die." And like, oh, some random Irish maid is the one who told him that it should be a story about redemption.
But actually, because what a lot of Dickens novels weren't actually written as novels; they were written as sort of monthly installments,
right?
In magazines.
Yeah, that was the common way to release stories at that time, serialized.
So Dickens would actually change the plot of the stories based on feedback.
Sure.
Based on feedback from readers, but yes, it is a little bit hokey.
Mm-hmm. Well, not just hokey, just I don't know. Yeah. Let's say that all the inspiration came from this made-up character. And no mention, of course, of the goblins who stole the sexton story. So,
Humph.
What do you think about the whole bit about the Christmas Carol scenes bleeding into his reality?
Yeah, that's where I think it gets a bit. That's where I think it gets a bit Doctor Who.
I
I
mean,
don't.
that's my favorite part.
Yeah, and
I like Doctor Who.
it's a shame that Christopher Plummer will never do an adaptation
Yeah, why
of
not? Oh,
a
right.
Christmas Carol. Well, because he's dead.
Right. Yep. That'll do it.
Yeah.
But yeah, because it is actually like the perfect cast overall, though, not just him, but all of
Yes.
them.
Yes, it is.
Although I have to shout out the Ghost of Christmas Past was super lame compared to Dickens' real imagination. See our classics episode where I read his description of that crazy ass ghost.
Yeah, but again, very, very difficult to do on screen.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah,
but they didn't. This one didn't even try. They're just like,
that's true. But he was working through the creative process, Elysia. Like,
mm-hmm,
it's not a
mm-hmm.
finished draft.
Right. That was the last thing he did when he was, hadn't slept for days.
And also, I do like the because one of the little subplots is like, how are they physically going to get the book published in time for Christmas? For it to hit the market in time,
Mm-hmm.
and like Dickens is having to pay out of his own pocket to get
Yep.
like the best illustrator in London.
Well,
And
that was real. That part's real.
but
Yeah.
there is a great little scene where he's trying to describe the ghost of Christmas Present, and
Right.
like the illustrator is just not having it because how can there be a ghost and it not be scary? Like, what do you want me to draw? I don't understand.
Yeah. Yeah, because he self-financed and he did this really fancy first edition. So indeed, he got John Leach, who was the preeminent illustrator at the time, to do hand-painted illustrations. So not that he would paint them all himself, obviously, but that meant that there were women who were painting each book. So that was really expensive. And he also had the red cloth cover and he had pages trimmed with gold, and he wanted on the inside the opening pages to be green, but then the dye was not sticking well. It was rubbing off on people's fingers, so he got reprinted so they could be yellow, so it didn't do that. So super expensive. And then he also got no money for all the unauthorized plays. There are no copyright protections, so he made money for this. It was absolutely a massive bestseller, but he did not make nearly as much money as you would expect. It was expensive.
And also, it was like a staple of Dickens' reading tours. So I think
Mhm.
we mentioned in the intro episode that Dickens would a lot of the way he made his money would be go on these book tours to America, around the UK. He even had one planned for Australia, although he never
Mm.
actually did it. But he would go and read out loud to an audience. And A
Mhm.
Christmas Carol was one of like the main,
Right.
one of the individual. You'd either read the whole book or one of the individual staves, one of the individual chapters, and often it would be paired with something from the Pickwick Papers.
Mhm.
So he made a lot of money that way.
Yeah.
When he died, his estate, I don't know whether this is true because I only got it off Wikipedia, but it would have been worth about £9 million in
Okay.
modern money.
Okay. Yeah.
So rich, but not
Yeah.
super rich.
No, as you would expect from one of the most famous authors to have ever lived.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to get more into specifically his life, the movie aside, after a quick break. Be right back. Okay, so I have to thank Arca Diego on Blue Sky, who read Charles Dickens' A Life by Claire Tomalin. And apparently she also wrote the book The Invisible Woman is adapted from. But anyway, so Arca Diego, I asked for, like some takes from that book on Dickens, just a sort of a high level summary. And this is what they said. He was really into the French Revolution and hated Queen Victoria, lol, which surprised me, to be honest. She was a big fan of his, though. He eventually met her because his daughter really wanted to be presented at court, but it was under a lot of duress. He didn't like the royals. He basically abandoned his wife and didn't have any real contact with her for years, and then hooked up with a teenager. He also didn't really want kids, but because Victorian times ended up with a bunch and just didn't really like most of them, Honestly, my main takeaway was that in terms of many social issues, except racism, he was terrible about that. He was a good person, but as a husband and father, he sucked. Sorry if I'm ruining your image of Dickens here. The epilogue of the book was really interesting because although sadly a lot of his children died, two of them lived into old age. His daughter spoke out about the difficulties of him being seen as a very compassionate man and of her having good childhood memories, but also knowing that he just didn't really care about some of them and seeing how he treated her mother. Whereas her brother really disapproved of her speaking out about it and thought that sort of stuff should be kept private. It was fascinating and sad. Dickens really did do a lot of good things for social issues, though. One fascinating story was about how he funded this home and school for women who wanted to get out of sex work, and how it didn't treat them like awful sinners, as such places often did. So it was just very frustrating. So many historical figures would have been nicer if they'd been born after therapy had been invented. Yeah, well, and today, if people would go to therapy. But yeah, I think that's a good summary from what I've heard,
Yeah,
what I've read.
yeah, and he was clearly a guy with issues, and not surprisingly, he had a very traumatic child. He had a very traumatic childhood.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think it's a typical. If you are not decent as a person to the people around you, I don't really care all that much about what you believe.
Mm.
Like, you have to live that. You have to demonstrate it. And yes, Dickens did do a lot of good. He also helped establish Great Ormond Street Hospital and put it on a financial sound financial footing. Because he did a lot of readings around fundraising for Great Ormond Street Hospital. But there's a difference between liking humanity and liking people, and I think
Mm.
Dickens liked humanity, but he didn't much like people.
Yeah. I mean, I guess though he probably did more good. We talked about this especially in our novella breakdown in the book club, but he probably did more good overall than, because it's not like he was awful to his wife, and I feel sad for that, but she had a good life with some independence. And
Yeah,
his
that's true.
children, like, he went and did this thing for his daughter because she really wanted to be presented at court even though he hated it. He was um I don't mean to make apologies for him. I'm just saying people are complex, so I don't want
Yeah,
to write off things just because, yeah, he was definitely also a bit of an asshole. Because you know what? When I defend people, I think part of me is worried that I'm also a bit of an asshole. So I hope people give me the grace that I would give to others. Um, but anyway, he was born in 1812, so he was 31 when he wrote A Christmas Carol, but he only lived to be 58 when he died of a stroke. And apparently, he really looked much older at that point. Like he was aging rapidly because of his lifestyle, or yeah.
a lot of travel,
Mm-hmm.
in an age when that wasn't common, and a lot of very hard work as well. He was constantly touring the country.
Yeah. And his older sister, Fanny, by the way, or which is short for Frances, she did have a sixth son named Henry Burnett Jr. So we saw in the film this character, and it was implied that Tiny Tim was based off of him. And yeah, that's probably true. And he had tuberculosis, so maybe that's what Tiny Tim had also. But then, yeah, it doesn't matter if Scrooge helps because you don't cure
Yeah,
tuberculosis.
you don't cure tuberculosis in the 1840s,
Mm-mm.
unfortunately.
Yeah, so maybe it wasn't that. But yeah, we talked already about the debtor's prison, but even though that was only a year of his life, he was forced to leave school and work in a factory for a while that, doing labels on these blacking tins. And that was when he was 12, but it affected him forever. And he is famously quoted as saying, "I know I do not exaggerate unconsciously and unintentionally the scantiness of my resources and the difficulty of my life. I know that, but for the mercy of God, I might easily have been, for any care that was taken of me, a little robber or a vagabond." So he's basically saying, if that inheritance hadn't come through and things turned around, or, anything had gone wrong, he could have been his whole life could have turned out differently. And I guess that's why he wanted to give people in those situations a second chance.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And he was a journalist before he was a fiction writer, so he was really studying these social issues, and he was especially horrified by how poor women and children were treated. And it's said that, and I talk about this in the novella episode with the song, the Tiny Tim song. But one of the main inspirations was a talk that he saw in Manchester in 1943 about, the rights.
1840.
1843. Yes, he was very old. He came back as his ghost, and then 1843. That about the working conditions, and factories and such. At the same time, one story that kept coming up, did you come across this about where his dad pointed out a house, or he liked a house and his dad said,
and when he became rich enough, he bought it.
Mm-hmm.
And also apparently he liked the fact the house is mentioned in Henry VI, Part 1 in Shakespeare, and Dickens got a real kick out of the fact he was living in a house that was mentioned, and it was mentioned in Shakespeare history.
Okay. So I want to pivot to another question, but do you have any other thoughts on Dickens' life itself?
No.
Okay. So the main question that we have to ask now is, did he invent Christmas as the movie claims?
No.
I mean, no.
No,
Was
he didn't.
he extremely influential in what we think of Christmas today? Yes.
Yes, he was.
I mean, even humbug, that wasn't a word he invented. That was a word used by P.T. Barnum before that, and The Wizard of Oz had it before this book.
And wasn't The Wizard of Oz written after?
Oh, right. The Wizard of Oz was 1900. Yeah, okay, that's fine. But P.T. Barnum was already using it.
Okay.
He didn't invent it. But yeah, Christmas itself, famously, a lot of people say it takes elements from pagan festivals, especially the Roman festival Saturnalia, which was like a solstice party holiday where people used green garlands and light decorations and gave presents. They especially gave candles to the children and the poor, but, presents. But there are some links, some people debate it, but no, I think, definitely it just makes sense. On winter solstice, it's the darkest time, people want to celebrate, let loose, feel cozy, connect with people. But then the turning point for the worse for Christmas was in 1643, when there was an ordinance passed encouraging subjects to treat the midwinter period with, quote unquote, the more solemn humiliation, because it may call to remembrance our sins and the sins of our forefathers who blah, 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 basically be more pious, don't have fun. And they outlawed Christmas pudding.
I mean, the one thing to say about that is, so obviously this is the height of the English Civil War, and then the Republic.
Yeah, this is Cromwell's time, right?
Protectorate. So this is a lot of this is obviously Puritanism, and everything that Elysia was saying. But also Christmas, particularly in big cities, was a time, even under the Elizabethan, even under the late Elizabethan period, the Tudor period, and the Stuarts, like Christmas in cities, it was a time where the authorities registered a massive uptick in public drunkenness,
right,
violence, revelry. So even before that ordinance, in the late Tudor, early Stuart period, you were getting all these local laws and ordinances basically telling people to calm the f down over Christmas, because this was getting out of hand.
Mm-hmm.
And leading to so Christmas actually had a bad reputation. And what I think the Victorians do is recast Christmas as this time to be with family, this sort of homely, domestic festival,
but at
rather than a public.
Right.
Festival.
But at the same time, they were, it became, especially in the early 1800s, was a time when historians and antiquarians were trying to bring back Christmas. And they held, they would idolize the Tudor Christmases, basically, like the Elizabethan era. They were like, that was peak Christmas. We should get that back. But then, they kind of picked and chose which aspects of it they incorporated
Yeah.
into the modern version. So it was especially popular with the royals more than the commoners because most people didn't have off work. So, and they didn't have money for frivolous things like that. But Victoria and Albert, who were king and queen at that time during the Victorian era, believe it or not, they would decorate their own tree every year. Can you imagine today's royals decorating their own tree and making gingerbread for their children?
No, well, I mean, at the moment, Prince Andrew will be lucky if he gets any kind of Christmas at all, because he is nothing good odor with the rest of the royals right now. But no, I can't imagine them. I can't imagine them decorating their own tree. Also, if you're king and queen, like, what do you buy as presents? You have everything. Like, what on earth would you
What did
give as a
people give
gift?
them? Oh, I got the feeling that it was mostly them giving out presents, and the presents they gave out were Christmas trees, because Albert was German, and this was a German tradition, the decorating of a fir tree, basically. And actually, the first Christmas tree in England was introduced by Victoria's grandmother, Queen Charlotte, who was the wife of George III. And yes, this is the Queen Charlotte from Bridgerton. And she decorated one for a Christmas party for children in 1800. But then Albert, 2 generations later, he was the one who really made them mainstream because he would send them to local schools and army barracks, and people are like, tree purdy.
But also, there's a really nice tradition ever since, I think it's a Second World War thing, that at the end of the Second World War in Christmas 1945, the Norwegian royal family sent like a massive, huge Christmas tree over
Okay.
to London to say thank you for liberating us.
Hmm.
And it's like put in the middle of Piccadilly Circus, and they still do that. The Norwegian royal family still send us a tree
Oh, really?
every
Since
year
the World
for,
War?
yeah,
Yeah.
since World War II, to say
Okay.
thank you for liberating us. So yeah, we always get like, it's always quite a big. It's always like a little and finally thing on the news when the massive tree arrives.
Yeah, I guess it's like the American equivalent. It's not sent by royalty from another country, but the tree in Rockefeller Square
Okay.
at the Rockefeller Center. Yeah. But back in Victorian times, mistletoe was a thing. I was kind of surprised to learn that. They didn't keep up with the dressing up like animals part of the Saturnalia, but mistletoe was from Saturnalia, and that was they would actually. It was acceptable for people. I questioned about people kissing at a party in one of the adaptations, and maybe they were kissing a little too much, but mistletoe was an excuse. And yeah, the Dickens, as Charles Dickens grew up, his family gave parties filled with music. So that explains why it's reflected in the story. And this was really like the prime period where people were gathering folk songs, and especially the British Isles. And they would take classic old melodies and put new words to them. And this is when Christmas carols started to become very popular.
And Christmas cards as well.
Yeah, so the first Christmas card, by complete coincidence, was quote unquote invented by Henry Cole in the same year, 1843, as A Christmas Carol was published. And he was just basically like, I have too many contacts. We need to standardize this Christmas message. In 1840s is also when the Christmas cracker came into use in the UK. Luke, Americans don't know what this is. Will you explain to them?
Okay, so how do you explain the Christmas cracker? Okay, a Christmas cracker is it's a cardboard tube wrapped in wrapping paper, and it has like a small fuse inside, and you pack it with like party tchotchkes, so like paper hats, a joke, a little puzzle, or a little game, and then one person takes one end of the cracker, one person takes the other end of the cracker. you pull the little charge goes off, so it makes a little bang.
Yeah.
And one person gets the end with nothing in it, and one person gets the end with all the tchotchkes in it.
Yeah, I've never experienced it, but I've seen it on British movies and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Something that Americans are more familiar with is 1867 was the first department store Santa. But really, I think what we think of as like the American side of the Christmas influence, that comes especially from a certain 1823 poem called A Visit from St. Nicholas that starts, "'Twas the night before Christmas, when all through the house not a creature." I do actually have the entire thing memorized. But after we're done with this stuff, we have to do a year that we dedicate to that.
Oh, really? There's enough. What? There's enough media around that.
I mean, maybe it won't be as extensive a series, but I definitely grew up with especially a Rankin Bass version. Okay. Short, yeah.
I only know that because it's at the end of National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation when he does the "'Twas the Night Before Christmas."
Oh, really? It wasn't like prevalent at all growing up?
No, it's not a thing you get. It's not a thing you get in the UK.
Okay, all right. Well, but this was that poem is one of the main things that, they took the Dutch version of Sinterklaas, which actually looks more like popish, with the tall hat and the robes and stuff, and described, this version. And then, of course, Coca-Cola in the 1930s really cemented what we think of as Santa looking like.
Holidays are coming. Holidays. Yeah, you always know it's Christmas when you get the. In the US, did you have the Coca-Cola ad with like the big truck of Coke, I guess so. Santa on rolling into town?
Yeah. That sounds like a few of them.
Yeah.
But it was interesting that at this time in the Victorian era in the UK, Father Christmas was seen similarly to the Ghost of Christmas Present. Like it was more like this green man, pagan, with food and merriment and boughs of holly in his hair.
And according to my grandparents, at any rate, that was true like well into the 1930s. So it really took. Like the red.
Oh, it's Coca-Cola.
Yeah, that is the power of Coca-Cola. That basically that was completely displaced in like the 1950s.
You do stockings as well?
Yes.
Okay. Apparently that started in the 1870s, and I guess it came via France and the US. I'm not sure between France and the US which was first.
I think probably France.
So, yeah, did Dickens invent Christmas? Obviously not. To be honest, he played a sizable role in shaping it into what we celebrate today, but just a sliver of it still.
Mm-hmm.
Any final thoughts on Dickens and Christmas?
Just that, it would be very hard to imagine what Christmas would be if A Christmas Carol didn't exist, or if all we had was the Sexton story, which, let's face it, is not. It's very much a prototype.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Does not have the warm-heartedness at all.
No, it really doesn't.
Well, we do have a couple pieces of feedback, so now opening the listener feedback channel. We didn't get a chance to collect much feedback. To be honest, I didn't really leave enough time for that between when I released the first episode and when we're recording this one. So if you still want to send in more feedback, we would love to hear it. And we will have a special section in the next Silo feedback episode, mailbag episode. So our first piece of feedback is from the TCS. Listened to the pod this morning and now watched all the A Christmas Carol shorts you're covering. To be honest, not a thing I thought I'd ever do, but you and Luke definitely got me interested. I really like them and was amazed at how different they all were. I have to own that I've not read the book, correcting that now via audiobook. So not having read it, I'm assuming each version included different portions to focus on, which I find really neat. And one reason I'm listening. I was impressed with the early 20th century tech in those original adaptations. It's a really good reminder of how amazing that must have been and how amazing the world is now. The 1971 short was my favorite, and likely the one I'm most familiar with, although it's also the only one where Scrooge doesn't actually intrude on the Cratchit family Christmas with his presence, which I've always considered rude, and which interjection does not come from the book. Thanks so much for doing this. The shorts were a great way to spend a Sunday morning. Well, thank you, the TCS. All right, any thoughts about the TCS feedback?
Yeah, thanks for the feedback, TCS. And I'm glad we could enliven your Sunday morning.
Yeah, very curious to hear if you keep watching the others and what you think. We also heard from Maureen D. Do many people hate the Jim Carrey Disney version, which, by the way, it's not one of the ones we're covering this year? It's often not included in these discussions. It's one of my favorites, especially the way the sign ages and the floor opens up with Christmas present, and Christmas past is closer to the book, too. I started reading The Man Who Invented Christmas, and I liked the film adaptation of it so much more. And yeah, Maureen, I would love to hear why you like the film adaptation so much more, because again, I haven't read the book, so I'm very curious about this. But yeah, I think the Jim Carrey one that's from 2009. It's on Disney. It's an animated one, and it's supposed to be extremely faithful. And it was one of the ones that just missed the list this year, but it's on the list that I've already put together a proto list for next year, and it's on it.
Yeah, sorry, we couldn't possibly cover every single adaptation of A Christmas Carol. We'd have had to have started in like September.
Yeah, at least. Paul Ken says, just downloaded the book, never read it, had no idea It's a Wonderful Life was based on A Christmas Carol, which, yeah, I said that offhand, and it's, I mean, I wouldn't say based on, but inspired by, let's say.
Yeah, inspired by is a better.
Yeah. And he says his favorite Christmas gift was space Legos. So I need to know what kind of space Legos, because I looked up, I Googled space Legos. Of course, there's Star Wars. Yeah. But there's also, you can make rockets and things like that. But then also the coolest thing I saw was somebody did the Milky Way galaxy. Or there's actually a kit you can buy to do the Milky Way galaxy. And it's sort of this like almost textured Lego painting.
Okay, if we don't see that as a relic at some point in Silo, I feel that would be a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I suppose it depends on Lego licensing deals.
Yeah.
All right, so that's our feedback. Any final thoughts, Luke?
No.
Okay. Well, we have one more episode coming in this series for this year anyway, and that is the twists. So the twists we're covering this year is Scrooged, Flintstone's Christmas Carol, A Diva's Christmas Carol, A New Diva's Christmas Carol, It's Christmas Carol, Spirited, and Scrooge, A Christmas Carol. And you can find links to all of those in the intro show notes, or not to all of those actually, but to a bunch of them. And you can find the full list of everything that we're covering in the intro episode, and we talk through it there. Although, yeah, we have, as we've said, already agreed we're going to do another round next year. So please let us know if we haven't covered your favorite yet. You'll find links to our email and Discord and Blue Sky in the show notes, plus links to the Supercast and Patreon book club if you're interested in the novella deep dive and extra short story, not to mention last year's coverage of The Greatest Gift, which is a story our It's a Wonderful Life episode from last year was based on, plus more Spooktober specials, and of course all the Silo and Hugh Howey and Dune stuff. If none of that's for you, great. We're just glad you're here. And if you enjoyed it, please do pass it on.
Yeah. In regards to doing it again next year, I don't think either myself or Elysia quite realised what we'd bitten off.
No.
But we've done our best in the ones we've chosen to be as sort of comprehensive as we can be. If your favourite isn't on there, rest assured we will get to it probably in 2025. But just accept our heartfelt apologies for the moment. And yeah, we really didn't realise the scale of this thing.
Yes.
We might have picked something else had we realised.
I keep discovering new adaptations that look really cool. So if you have a favorite, please do let us know, because now I've got a full list going, and we'll see. We'll see when we get to those.
The way it's growing, it's going to be 2025, 2026, maybe 2027.
Well, we're going to do 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, also one of those years.
Yeah.
All right. Well, do also check out the cheesy Netflix Christmas coverage on the Lorehounds feed. Plus, of course, our weekly Doom Prophecy breakdowns and also all the other affiliates on the network, like the Star Wars Canon Timeline podcast by me, Never Mind the Music with Music and Psychology, Radioactive Ramblings, and Properly Howard movie reviews. See you soon for part 2, The Twists. Until then, try not to think too much about what an asshole Charles Dickens was.